Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you're located, and or good evening for our friends overseas. And thank you for joining us on this latest edition of ASMIA's webinars. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to host our friend and colleague, Professor Noam Stillman. Professor Stillman, above all his many credentials, is also the chair of ASMIA's Academic Council. And he is a prolific writer and speaker and an expert really on the history of Jews in the Arab world. His talk this afternoon is entitled "The Jews of the Islamic World in Modern Times, Transformation and Transplantation." Noam will be talking for about 25 minutes or so, and then we will go into a Q&A. We will do our best to get to all the questions that we have this afternoon. If not, you could always email us after, and we will do our best to answer them as well. So I'll repeat those housekeeping issues after we're done. But Noam, it's wonderful to have you and to see you. And the virtual floor is now yours.
The long and dynamic history of the Jews in the Islamic world, a history that is only a few centuries shorter than that of the entire post-Second Temple diaspora, is now virtually at an end. As World War II drew to its conclusion, there were more than 1 million Jews living in the vast expanse of the domain of Islam, the Dar al-Islam, as Muslims call it, with some 750 to 800,000 in the Arabic-speaking lands and approximately 300,000 in Turkey, Iran, and the Central Asian republics. Today, there are barely 3,500 Jews in the Arab countries, and these are overwhelmingly in Morocco and Tunisia, with about 2,500 in the former and about 1,000 in the latter. Turkey now has about 17,000 Jews, down from 80,000 at war's end, and with the country becoming more Islamic fundamentalist, more anti-Israeli, and yes, more anti-Semitic under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, their number will continue to decline even more rapidly. Iran's Jewish population has shrunk dramatically from 8,700 to 8,700, down from 80,000 on the eve of the Islamic Revolution in 1979 that brought Ayatollah Khomeini and his regime to power. And many of these Jewish communities had roots in antiquity, going back long before the birth of Islam, before most of what we call today the Arab countries had any Arabs, and before the Turkish Republic had any Turks. And as for Iran, historical Persia, of course, Jewish involvement with the royal court in Sasanian times is memorialized in the Book of Esther. Now, the virtual disappearance of the Judeo-Islamic diaspora was a relatively recent and rapid phenomenon. Within a mere 2 decades following the establishment of the State of Israel, the overwhelming majority of Jews in the Arab world, from Iraq in the east to Morocco in the west, abandoned their countries of origin, primarily for Israel, and secondarily for France and go to, there we go. Here you see a map showing the huge diaspora, mostly facing Israel, but also going up to Western Europe as well. Jews also went, of course, to other countries of Western Europe and even to the Americas and Australia. Now, the decline of the Jewish communities of Turkey and Iran was not as precipitous as it was for the Arab countries, since neither were party to the hostile actions of the Arab states against the newly founded State of Israel. And in fact, they maintained diplomatic and commercial and even military ties with it until the rise of Islamic regimes, which then accelerated the Jewish exodus from those two countries. Now, in Israel, Jews from the Islamic world, usually referred to collectively as Sfaradim, as Mizrahim and Sfaradim Mizrahim, they and their descendants now make up over half the population. And they have put their own distinctive imprint on Israel's evolving society and culture, in the arts, in literature, in music, and in language, and even, I would add, to the collective diet. I would simply note with regard to the latter that in any supermarket today in Israel, any grocery store, you can find several different brands of matbucha, which is the Moroccan cooked tomato and green pepper salad. In the refrigerated section, you can find a bottle of Tunisian style bucha, along with the ubiquitous arak in the section of alcoholic beverages. And you can find Yemenite jahnoun and malawah in the frozen pastry section. And most hotels in Israel and restaurants offer the Tunisian shakshuka, which is sunny side up eggs in a tomato sauce, on their breakfast menu. The influence in the domain of language is too considerable and linguistically too technical for me to go into detail here, but let me just cite one example of the Hebrew translation of Jeff Kinney's best-selling book for young people, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, which in Hebrew is Yoman Shel Chnun. Chnun, or Chnuna, is the Arabic word for snot, but it's used by North African Jews as a term for a runny-nosed, wimpy kid, and it's been picked up into general Hebrew usage. And as for the imprint of Jews from the Islamic world in the political domain, I would simply note that many have and continue to serve in the Knesset and in the present cabinet, in fact. Aryeh Deri, who was born in Morocco, serves as interior minister and is head of the Shas party. Likewise, former commander-in-chief of the Israeli army, Gadi Eisenkot, who was commander-in-chief from 2015 to 2019, he is of Moroccan parentage, and people often ask me, how come a Moroccan has a German or Germanic last name, but Eisenkot, in fact, is Berber. It means a gazelle in Berber, and apparently when his parents arrived on the boat at Haifa, the person who heard it added the I sound to make it sound more Ashkenazi. The number of Jews who have had a major impact on the performing arts and on arts in general is simply too numerous to mention. However, I would like to mention at least a few of the more recent authors whose significant literary works have made the modern experience of their ethnic communities and in their new country part of the heritage of all Israelis. And among them, I would hasten to mention Eli Amir and Sami Michael from Iraq, Amnon Shamosh from Syria, and Jacqueline Kahanoff from Egypt. Each of these that I've just mentioned are writers of novels and short stories, some of which have been turned into films and plays, by the way. But I would also include Erez Biton, an Algerian born of Moroccan origin, who was the first Mizrahi poet to give poignant expression to the inner conflicts of acculturation into the new Israeli society. And Biton has been dubbed as nothing less than a cultural icon here in Israel. He was the president of the Hebrew Writers Association, and he headed a commission, the Biton Commission, appointed by the Ministry of Education 5 years ago, charged with making recommendations for the improvement of the integration of the Sephardi Mizrahi heritage into the Israeli middle and secondary school education, a commission which, by the way, I'm proud to say that I was a member of. Now, as I already noted, France was a country with the second largest immigration. After all, we're talking about transplantation as well as transformation of Jews from the Islamic world, and nearly 250,000 Jews from the Maghreb, and 7,000 to 10,000 from Egypt, and a smaller number from Lebanon and Syria came into France, where they now constitute the majority of French identifying Jewry. Their impact there has also been profound, transforming and reviving French Jewry, which had been decimated by the Holocaust and by assimilation. And in France, any of you who go there, you will find most synagogues, including those that were originally Ashkenazi, now follow the Sephardi rite, and the Sidur Petah Eliyahu, published by the Kolbo Publishing House, which was originally founded in Fez, Morocco, by the Charbit family, is now the most commonly used prayer book in the country. Now, although the impact of Jewish immigration from the Islamic world has first and foremost been upon French Jewry and Jewish life in France, it also has had a not insignificant impact on the broader French cultural life, particularly in the high cultural domain, with some of the leading public intellectuals in France, such as Jacques Derrida, the late Jacques Derrida, Hélène Cixous, and Bernard-Henri Lévy, as well as literary figures such as Albert Memmi, Edmond Jabès, Gisèle Halimi, Nin Moati, Eliette Abicassis, and Paula Jacques, to mention just a very few who've made major contributions to the French literary scene. And these I've singled out because they have made their own heritage an integral part of their intellectual and literary oeuvre. Jews from the Islamic world also made their mark in French politics, albeit nowhere near approaching the indelible mark made on Israeli political scene, of course, for obvious reasons. But given the different nature of the two immigrations, however, I would just mention in passing that Audrey Azoulay from Morocco was the French Minister of Culture from 2016 through 2017, and is now the Director General of UNESCO. But she's a special case. Her father, André Azoulay, is the chief advisor to King Mohammed VI of Morocco. Another prominent figure in the realm of politics, who was also born in Morocco, is David Assouline, an important socialist senator who, when he was first elected, was the youngest person to serve in the French Senate. Now, the Israeli-Arab conflict may have been the immediate catalyst for the mass exodus of Jews from the Arab countries, to which we might add the end of French colonialism in North Africa, and later still, for the non-Arab Muslim countries, the rise of Islamist regimes. But the Arab-Israeli conflict was by no means the sole cause. The underlying forces that paved the way and contributed to this seemingly sudden rupture had been at work since the dawn of the modern era, and were part and parcel of the impact of the West and the process of modernization that affected both Jews and Muslims, albeit in very different ways. Now, without getting into an arid discussion of just when the modern era began in the Arab and wider Islamic world, I would just observe that from the end of the 18th century through the 19th and 20th, and indeed in many parts of that cultural zone to this very day, the growing economic, political, and cultural intrusion of the West has been perceived as a serious threat by the majority community, whereas by the Jews and most native Christians, it was viewed as liberation from their traditional humble status as Ahl al-Dhimma, as protected monotheistic subjects of the Islamic State. Now, in the heyday of the Dar al-Islam, of the Islamic Empire, basically from the mid-9th to the mid-12th centuries, and during the first century of Ottoman rule over the Arab world, that is the 15th century, the Islamic social and legal system governing Christians and Jews was, by pre-modern standards, a relatively tolerant one that allowed a good measure of religious and economic freedom and internal communal autonomy, but which since the latter Middle Ages has been narrowly interpreted and rigorously imposed with discriminatory taxes, identifying clothing, often humiliating. This is in Islam, this is known as a khiyar, or differentiation. And in many places, again, as of a late period, starting more or less in the 15th century, ghettoization, the Malah in Morocco, the Harat al-Yahud in Tunisia, the Qat al-Yahud in Yemen, and the Mahal in Iran. And in some countries, also, up until relatively modern times, the coming of European colonialism, you had corvée labor, sukhra. Now, both Jews and Christians were quick to see that increased European intervention and penetration into the affairs of their region meant a weakening of the traditional Islamic norms of society and could only better their own position, which was traditionally one of religious and legal inferiority, what the Quran calls maskana wal dhul. But their insider-outsider status had permitted non-Muslims, Jews and Christians, to fill a variety of functions that Muslims chose not to do. One of these was to serve as intermediaries, and this goes back all the way to the Middle Ages, between European commercial interests in the Middle East and North Africa and the surrounding Muslim society. The large number of Sephardi and Livornese Jews in the ports and interior commercial centers around the Mediterranean, with their knowledge of Spanish and Italian, and their willingness to learn foreign languages, and their connections with co-religionists in Europe, made, and somewhat later in India and the Far East and the New World, these were particularly prominent in this role. Jews were particularly prominent in this role. And furthermore, they were regarded by the local Islamic societies as being eminently suited to the disagreeable, though necessary, task of having extended intercourse with foreign infidels. This comprador class, in sociology and anthropology, we call these intermediaries compradors. This comprador class was, to be sure, an elite minority. The vast number of Jews in the Islamic world were poor. But throughout the last 4 decades of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th, many Jews began to avail themselves of the benefits of a modern European education provided by various cultural and religious missionaries who flooded into the Middle East and North Africa. And for Jews, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the first international Jewish aid organization founded in Paris in 1860, became the chief provider of a modern education in the major towns and cities of most Arab countries and in Turkey from 1860s onward. And there is a scene from the first Alliance Israelite school in Tetuan, Morocco, founded in 1862. You'll notice they're still in traditional garb. That was going to change very soon. By the way, here's a 1950s shot from Casablanca, from a non-Alliance school of a traditional school, what education was like for Jews prior to Alliance. But here is the Alliance girls' school in Baghdad in the 19th century, at a time when, by the way, no girls went to school in the Islamic world. Here's from another one, the bigger school, the boys' football team. Here's a gym class in the Cairo Alliance School from the 1940s. They also had, of course, technical classes. Here is a Alliance sewing class. And just one more. Here's from the boys' high school, the boys and girls high school, the mixed gender high school in Cairo in the 1940s. Now, with Alliance, French, rather than Arabic, became the language of high culture for thousands upon thousands of Jews. And with the notable exception of Iraq and one or two individuals in Egypt and Lebanon, Jews were singularly unattracted by the Nahda, the literary Arabic revival, which, by the way, started with Christians in missionary schools in Lebanon, and which then spread through the Arab world and was in some ways parallel to the Hebrew Haskalah. By 1900, it was estimated that over 100,000 pupils had received an Alliance education in the Ottoman Empire, basically a Western French-style education. And in North Africa, that same number, that same time, by 1900, it was probably about 25,000 more had received Alliance education. The Alliance gave its pupils, which, remember, are both boys and girls at a time when education for girls was absolutely unheard of in this part of the world. It gave them far more than a modern education. It gave them a new self-image, and one that was very different from that of the humble dhimmi, of the humble protected inferior status. It gave them a new mobility. Jews left areas of lesser economic development for greater ones within the Islamic world. For example, from the Ottoman Aegean Islands and Syria and Morocco for Egypt, Algeria, and also for Europe and South America. Until the Second World War, the overwhelming majority of Jews in Venezuela, for example, were from North Morocco and graduates of the Alliance schools. So they knew French, but because they're from North Morocco, they also knew Spanish in its North African Ladino form called Hakatia. And in fact, the Venezuelan who won a number of years ago the Nobel Prize for Medicine, Professor Ben-Zaken, was of Moroccan origin. Now, the Alliance created new expectations and helped to arouse a sense of international Jewish solidarity among the Jews of the Islamic world. Its Hebrew motto was Kol Yisrael Chaverim, all Israel are comrades. And ironically, although it was officially neutral and privately hostile towards Zionism prior to World War II, the Alliance actually fostered Zionism by including modern Hebrew as part of its curriculum, and by allowing Jewish youth organizations to use its facilities. And some of these youth organizations had a definite Zionist orientation. The Alliance produced cadres of modern educated Jews who had a distinct advantage of opportunity over the largely uneducated Muslim masses, as the Islamic world and the Arab lands were being drawn ineluctably into what the great sociologist Immanuel Wallerstein has dubbed the modern world economic system. They filled lower and middle level positions in the new sectors of the economy, banking, insurance, transport, and other services. And together with the rapidly evolving native Christians who benefited from missionary schools, Jews came to have a place in the economic life of the Middle East and North Africa that was far out of proportion to their numbers or social status in the general population. And as the economic historian Charles Issawi has pointed out, this success and their foreign ties and their Western acculturation and the economic advancement were deeply resented by the Muslim Arab majority. And this conspicuous overachievement by some Jews and Christians would contribute to their undoing as a group in the 20th century with the rise of militant nationalism in the Islamic world. Now, rapid acculturation, overachievement in certain economic spheres, and a weakening of some tradition among some of the more modern and Western educated Jews may have at first glance seemed parallel to the emergence of European Jewry from the ghetto. However, in Europe, the emancipation and modernization of Jews resulted in greater assimilation into the surrounding culture. But in the Islamic world, the result was quite the opposite. Jews there became further alienated from society around them. And although Arabic-speaking Jewry had never been totally a part of Arab culture, it nevertheless shared many more cultural elements with its Muslim neighbors prior to the modern era than did its European brethren with their Christian compatriots. But the Jews of the Arab world in particular had no vested interest in the old social and political order of their traditional overlords. Therefore, they welcomed European political and economic domination that began with the French conquest of Algeria in the 1830s and culminated with the carving up of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. It was their misfortune to discover that the hopes they had placed in the British, the French, and the Italian masters would be disappointed or downright betrayed again and again. In the 19th century, the European powers sought to extend their protection of the non-Muslim minorities, in part out of sincere sense of do-gooding, and in part to gain greater influence in the region. But once much of the Middle East and the North Africa were under European control, in the 20th century, the colonial and mandatory authorities were frequently more concerned with appeasing, or at least not offending, the Muslim majority than in protecting the Jewish and Christian minorities, especially as the tide of Arab and Islamic nationalism began to rise and swell. And it was this powerful tide that would eventually engulf and destroy the Jewish and some of the Christian communities in the Arab world. Sadly, this destructive tide continues to batter the Christian communities in Iraq, in Syria, and Egypt to this very day, with the present instability plaguing the region. And there's an Arab proverb, Man salaf as-sabt laq al-had qaddamahu. After Saturday is past, one encounters Sunday. Now, the original proverb had nothing to do with the way it's used now. It was for the business world. But it has come to be a popular cry in some circles for after the Saturday people, that is the Jews, the Sunday people, the Christians, will get first one, then the other. Now, it's been suggested at times that the Jews failed to hear the call of Arab nationalism when they had the chance. But I would argue on the contrary, they heard it only too well. Arab Christians, some of them did rally to Arab nationalism, but it did them no good. They never really had a place, there never really was a place for them in the militant national movements with their strong pan-Arab and pan-Islamic overtones. And furthermore, from 1929 onward, Arab nationalism became increasingly anti-Zionist, and despite frequent disclaimers, it became increasingly difficult for nationalist leaders in the Arab Muslim world to differentiate between Yahud, Jews, and Sahayana, Zionists. Also, growing Arab admiration for German National Socialism and for Italian fascism in the 1930s and 40s, and a concomitant receptivity to their anti-Semitic rhetoric also ensured that Jews would find no place for themselves in the Arab nationalist camp and the society that it would create. And I would only point out that Hitler's Mein Kampf, was a best-selling book, by the way, with anti-Arab passages expurgated, but it was a bestseller in the 1930s and 40s. And anti-Semitic literature, and of course, as one knows, the Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini was a supporter of the Nazis. In fact, when he had to escape from Iraq, went on to Berlin. But also, a great deal of anti-Semitic literature comes into the Arab world in the 1930s and 40s. I would just point out, well, this actually is the Matzah of Zion, which is a blood libel work that was written by Mustafa Tlas, actually for his doctorate, who was the Minister of Defense in Syria. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion also was a bestseller for a long time in Arab bookstores, in many editions. And when World War II came, it demonstrated to the Jews of Arab lands with painful clarity just how vulnerable they were. In Iraq, during the pogrom of June 1st and 2nd, 1941, known as the Farhud, they saw the kind of violence that could be visited upon them under a native regime. In Italian Libya and the French Maghreb, they saw what anti-Semitic colonial rule could do to them, while much of the Arab population looked on with indifference. And although there were, I would quickly hasten to add, there were exceptions, notable exceptions. Robert Satloff has written an excellent, important book called Among the Righteous on people within the Islamic world who defended Jews at the time of the Holocaust. But they could only imagine what might have befallen them if King Farouk had been able to welcome Rommel into Egypt, as he had hoped to do prior to the Battle of El Alamein. And the lesson of the Holocaust in Europe was not lost upon most of the Jews of the Arab world. They emerged from their wartime experience with a heightened sense of Jewish consciousness and esprit de corps. The North African Jews who comprised who comprised over half of all the Arabic-speaking Jewry, referred to their retour sur soi, to their return to self. And among young people in particular, there was an increased receptivity to Zionism as the ultimate answer to the anti-Semitism of both European colonialists and the nationalists. Events, of course, moved rapidly in the years immediately following World War II, and in short order, totally undermined the already weakened underpinnings of the Jewish communities in the Arab world. And it made little difference whether Jews abjectly mouthed anti-Zionist lines, as in Syria, donated decent sums of money to the Palestinian cause, as in Iraq, or publicly proclaimed their loyalty, as in Egypt, or completely identified themselves with the colonial powers in Algeria. In the end, they all shared a similar fate and chose to emigrate or flee from the lands of their birth. And although there are, if perhaps in the question and answer period, certain signs of new positive happenings within some of the Islamic world, for all intents and purposes, the long history of the Jews of the Islamic world has come to an end.
Wonderful. Thank you, Noam. That's a fascinating conversation and unpacking a lot of these issues. There's a lot to discuss. There are several questions already, so I won't take away from those questions. Suzanne, why don't we go to the Q&A and we'll let Noam tackle them, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, thank you. So the first question we have for you, Professor Stillman, a bit more of a rhetorical question, is asked by Jay. What might have occurred to the Jews in the countries if Israel did not exist?
That, of course, is what we call in the profession counterfactual histories. They are, of course, extremely entertaining to undertake, but of course, since it didn't happen, nothing can be said. Basically, the direction that most of the country, first of all, most of the Arab countries were moving in the post-World War II period, or even from the 1920s or 30s on, forgetting about Zionism, forgetting about the state of Israel, was one in which the minorities, Christians and Jews, were being looked upon as a foreign element. In Egypt, certainly in Egypt, that was the case. It was the case in Iraq, and there again, I don't indulge in counterfactual history. We sometimes refer to it as a form of intellectual onanism, perhaps pleasurable, but it produces no results.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to skip around here a little bit. If we have time for all the questions, we'll address them. But I'm going to ask you this question from Yosef Robinson. He asks, why did hardly any Tunisian Jews end up in Canada when many Moroccan Jews came over to Canada? Was it because France made it easier per capita for the Tunisians than for the Moroccans to get visas, despite the same colonial conditions?
That's a good question. First of all, of course, you had many more Tunisian Jews who were able to obtain French citizenship than Moroccans, and so although the majority did go to Israel, a large number went to France, and they didn't go to France as foreigners, but as French citizens. As by the time they're coming. Also, I would just add one other thing: is that Tunisian Jews the Zionist movement was much stronger in Tunisia than it was in Morocco, and Tunisia had a big, a very large, extensive Zionist journals and so on, schools with Zionist orientation, and most of them, by the time they start going to Canada, Morocco, which had the largest population, now were looking for other places to go, and Canada was one of them. But most of them, even most of them who went to Canada, went via France. They got visas into France and then went to Canada. And for example, Montreal has nearly 30,000 Moroccan Jews and as I recall, Toronto has about 7,000.
Thank you. Okay, so here we have a question from Carl Goldberg. He asks if you could kindly discuss some of the Islamic doctrinal reasons why the Quran and the Sunnah for the Muslims very negative attitudes towards Jews.
I would hasten to add, like all great religions, Islam has a lot to say, very often contradictory, on the same subject. There are positive, basically most of the early parts of the Quran, when Muhammad was still in Mecca, before he made the hijrah to Medina in 622, most of the references to the Banu Israel, the children of Israel, is positive. After Muhammad in 622 goes to Medina, comes into conflict with the local Jewish community, most of the material in the Quran about Jews is more negative. And they tend not to be called the children of Israel anymore, or Israelites, but Yahud, the Jews. I would simply point out that Anwar Sadat used Islam to make war against Israel. He used Islam, cited Islam to make peace with Israel. And the present Abrahamic covenant, the Brit Avraham, with the Gulf states and now Morocco and Sudan and so on. Again, you look, I would just quickly point out, in the Jerusalem Talmud, it says, even the best of Gentiles deserves death. And in the Babylonian Talmud, which is the Talmud, it says that the righteous among the Gentiles have their place in the world to come. Again, this is typical of, and if you look at when I said in the Middle Ages that in its heyday, between basically about 750 to 1250, the Islamic world was by all standards relatively tolerant of its non-Muslim minorities, and many of the restrictions of the so-called Pact of Omar, the legal theoretical document which differentiates Muslims and Jews, many of the rules were not observed. Islam was a far more rational, or I should say, a far more rational brand of Islam ruled in those centuries, and Jewish intellectuals and Muslim intellectuals could have discussions together and respect one another. And Islam had unlike Europe, had a secular field in science, in medicine, in commerce, in which Muslims, Christians, and Jews could meet on a more or less equal basis. And all of this changes as the Islamic world turns in on itself becomes more fundamentalist, and the famous dictum of a fundamentalist theologian, al-Ashari, billah kayf, without asking why, became the regnant dictum in religion. That wasn't the case before. In the 19th century, you had those who wanted to modernize and to interpret more liberally, and so on. And you do have Islamic theologians who do this. Most of them not in the Islamic world, I would hasten to add. But for example, the Mufti of Nice, of Nice in France, and others, and it's interesting to see that the Emirates, which were basically Bedouin, these were just Bedouin communities. They had money coming from the pearl fishing and so on, but only in the really modern times do they flourish. And there has been a desire, and I monitor broadcasts from all of these places all the time, and you have people who even in places like Saudi Arabia, a think tank where some authorities say, look, we have to rethink who our enemies are. Look at Syria. 500,000 Muslims have been killed, mostly by other Muslims. In all of the wars between Israel and the Arab countries on both sides, you don't have that kind of numbers. And in Morocco, for example, the king has been leading a movement to have more liberal theologians, by the way, including women. So this is not what we see is the product of the deterioration of the Islamic world from the 13th century on, with the exception of about 100 years into the Ottoman conquest, when they too start to go afterwards onto a more fundamentalist track. But it's not. I would say it's not hopeless, nor was it always quite as negative looking as we see from the worst periods, which of course were several hundred years in length. But still in all, again, I would just hasten to add, great religions say lots of things, and sometimes they're contradictory.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question we have for you is, how would you explain the birth of a new Jewish community in the UAE? Does this mean that there is hope for Jewish life in the Islamic world under certain conditions?
First of all, the Jewish community in the United Arab Emirates is not an indigenous community. The head of the community, Mr. Creel, is a South African. I have been in contact with the community. Many of the people who are there are working for international companies. There are some Jews of Islamicate. I hate the word, but we use it as that is from the cultural world of Islam, Islamicate background. But most of them are not. Does this mean who knows? We're not talking about a very large community to begin with, but the Emirates have definite. They well admire the success Israel has shown. They're frightened to death of Iran, of Shiite Iran, which of course is not far away. Does this mean a new renaissance of Jewish life in the Islamic world? I doubt it. These are still basically foreign communities, and by the way, they're under the aegis of the ruling family. The only place where you have Jewish life, which is indigenous and part of the culture, is in Morocco, where again, it's gone from almost 300,000 down to 2,500. But in Morocco, and I mentioned already that the king's chief advisor, and by the way, before him, other chief advisors for his father were Jews. Morocco has been Morocco felt the loss of its Jewish community, what it meant economically, culturally, and socially for the country. And the royal family has gone out of its way already for 2 generations to maintain contacts with the enormous, I said they were originally 300,000. There are over 1 million people of Moroccan descent now in Israel and the diaspora. They have international organizations, and the Moroccan monarchy has worked extremely hard to maintain its contacts. It also has, even when it didn't have diplomatic relations with Israel, it had discrete, both economic and I would even add strategic relations with Israel. And there is a place where there is a semblance of Jewish life in its historical context, and it's not there. And again, I'm a historian. I have enough trouble trying to figure out the past. I don't predict the future, but I do think that things bode well. And just a few weeks ago, I was on everything is on Zoom now, on an international conference sponsored by Bar-Ilan University with its Dahan Center, and Morocco. And we had Moroccans who spoke Hebrew, on there. And Moroccan intellectuals come to Israel, some in the past very discreetly. But you also, by the way, see it in cinema. Morocco and Tunisia, the North African Jews were also much more assimilated, if you will, into the cultural life. And filmmakers, Laila Marakshi, Kamal Hashkar, and Hassan Ben Jaloun in Morocco, and in Tunisia, Nouri Bouzid and Farid Bourdir have been making films which have nostalgia for the Jews who were there in the past. In Morocco, they get much more support from the government, which, by the way, has added Jewish history of Morocco into its school curriculum over the past 2 years. In Tunisia, the new president, Kais Saied, is virulently anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. He called the Jews, even of the country, although he said it was taken out of context, a band of thieves. There, it's more difficult for intellectuals like Bouzid and Bourdir and so on but they do it. They make some of these films are excellent. Man of Ashes, for example, Bouzid's film, and there's the nostalgia for his growing up with his Jewish friends in Tunisia. So there, I think at least in the case of Morocco, there's more chance of a continued Jewish presence that has a traditional cultural element. In the case of the United Arab Emirates, they've also delighted to have Israeli tourism. Just looking in the papers the other day, there were luxury tours of the UAE with kosher food and so on and so forth available. But I don't think of that as historical Jewish communities being reestablished.
want to thank you again for taking the time. I want to thank again our audience for taking the time this afternoon to join us. Again, there's a lot to discuss, and obviously we hope to continue the conversation. If we did not get to your question this afternoon, I really apologize for that. We will do our best. If you email us, we can tackle them and pass them on to Professor Stillman, and
I'll be happy to answer.
Promise to answer them in a timely fashion. So again, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Noam, for joining us from Israel. We will be continuing our webinar series soon, so be on the lookout for more notices. And again, a lot to discuss as the region is constantly ever changing, as we learned today, and from our previous speakers as well. So be on the lookout for that. And thank you again for taking the time to join us. And I hope everybody's staying safe and healthy wherever they are. And have a great day.